The secret videos of Pentagon UAPs have been suppressed from public view. I have never been a believer in conspiracy theories, but I am not blind to what happens around me either. Working as a maintenance technician on oil rigs for more than a decade, most people have no idea what life is like here. Endless days in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by the sound of waves and the constant hum of machines. It's the kind of place where you learn to trust only your instincts and your colleagues. That's why when I saw what I saw that night, I knew it was not ordinary. Whatever was there, it wasn't normal. And I'll be honest, I'm still trying to understand what happened, because until today, it seems like something taken from a movie, only that it was real, and I was in the middle of it all. It was about 2 a.m, and I was on the night shift. The sky was clear, with a full moon illuminating the ocean like a giant mirror. Suddenly the calm was broken by a strange noise coming from the north side of the platform. It was something between a buzz and a bang, as if something very heavy were moving underwater. I went to the edge to look, and it was then that I noticed a blue light blinking right under the surface. At first, I thought it was some equipment of ours, maybe a submersible drone, but the brightness was too intense and seemed to be moving too fast for something done by us. I radioed one of my colleagues who was in the control room, but before he could answer, the brightness became stronger, and what I saw next made me question everything I found out to know. The light started moving in circles, as if it was scanning the area around the platform. I can't describe exactly the size of the thing, but it seemed big, bigger than any submarine or submersible vehicle I've ever seen. As I watched, I felt the entire platform vibrate slightly, as if something massive was just below us. That's when one of the alarms started to go up in the control room, decreasing some kind of interference in the depth sensors. On the radio, my colleague shouted that the sonar was picking up something huge, but without any known signature. He said, almost in panic, that it seemed to be metallic, but with an irregular shape that did not make sense. I caught a cold in the spine. Whatever was down there, it was not something common. A few seconds later, a light rose to the surface. I could see the water bubbling, as if something was about to emerge. But instead of something solid, the light simply hovered over the water, floating a few meters from the platform. Now it was clear. It was a circular object, perhaps the size of a small stadium, with a surface that seemed to change texture constantly. It was as if he were alive, reacting to the environment around him. As bizarre as it may seem, it didn't emit something like that. The initial tinnitus had disappeared. The silence was almost worse than the noise, as if everything around had stopped. All the hairs of my body were heathered, and my heart beat so fast that it seemed to echo in my head. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, just watching that thing. It didn't look like something a human could build. The surface changed color, alternating between shades of blue, silver, and black, as if it was pulsing. I tried to get my phone to record, but when I took it out of my pocket, I realized that he was dead. In fact, all the lights on the outside of the platform were off, and the radios were completely mute. It was as if that thing had drained all the energy around. The only sound was the waves crashing against the platform's pillars. I looked up and realized that the other guys had gone out to sea too. They all had the same expression, a mixture of fear and fascination. Nobody said anything. It was as if the words were not enough to explain what we were selling. Then suddenly that thing started moving again. But it wasn't like a helicopter or a drone. It was softer, as if it were gliding through the air. She made a quick move to the right and then to the left, in a way that defied any logic or physics I knew. It started to slowly descend back into the water. The glow gradually disappears completely beneath the surface. But it didn't end there. As soon as it disappeared, we heard another sound, a loud and deep snap of the ear, as if something massive were compressing itself down there. The vibration returned, this time much stronger, as if the entire structure of the platform was being tested. Someone said we had to evacuate, but before we could react, everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. After everything apparently returned to normal, no one could say anything. We talked there, looking at each other, trying to understand what the devils had just happened. I went to the control room to check the monitors, but the records were completely messed up. Depth sensors showed incoherent readings, as if something huge had descended hundreds of meters in a matter of seconds, but the data was too inconsistent to draw any conclusions. My colleague in the control room was clear and shaking, saying he had never seen anything like it. He did it, for a brief moment. The instruments picked up something so massive that it seemed impossible, almost the size of a small town. As we tried to organize our thoughts, one of the supervisors appeared and tried to stop us talking about what happened. "That didn't happen, do you understand?" he said with a firmness that left no room for discussion. Later that night, I began to feel ill, as if a weight was instructed on my chest. I don't know if it was fear or something related to what we saw, but I knew it wasn't just me. Other guys were also strange, quiet, and visibly shaken. Before the end of the shift, we were called to an emergency meeting. A group of people we've never seen before appeared on the platform, saying they were from the government. They wanted to know exactly what happened, because they did not ask any questions, they just gave us direct orders. They said the incident was classified, and that any information leak would result in serious consequences. After that, we were instructed to go back to work as if nothing had happened. But how can you just ignore something like that? The following days were strange, to say the least. The whole team seemed to be walking on eggshells, avoiding talking about what had happened. Still, small comments escaped here and there. One of my colleagues swore that he caught something from the bottom of the sea just before the light appeared, like a metallic sound reverberating in the platform structure. Another said that the alarms of the pressure sensors had gone off by themselves a few hours before, but no one paid attention because these failures happen from time to time. Every detail seemed to connect the pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to assemble. But what bothered me the most was when I realized that some of the security cameras had been removed. I asked the supervisor about it, but he only gave me a warning look and quickly changed the subject. I got the impression that someone was trying to erase any evidence of what happened that night. Shortly after, I received a formal notice to transfer to another platform. They said it was a routine change, but he did not swallow this explanation. It seemed more an attempt to get me away from any possible investigation or questioning. Before I left, I went to one of the engineers who was on shift with me that night, and he promised he'd lost all this. He hesitated, looked around to make sure no one was listening, and said something that still chills me. What we saw there was not from here. And if anyone knows what it is, they're not telling us. That stuck in my head while I was packing my stuff. The idea that something so strange and possibly dangerous is happening without the public knowing makes me uneasy to this day. And worse, knowing that I will never have concrete answers about what I saw. Even after months, I still can't get that night out of my head. I began to obsessively research similar perspectives on oil rigs or in coastal areas. Found that there are reports scattered around, but none of them comes close to what we saw. The stories are usually vague, and people reported going into detail, probably for fear of being discredited or persecuted. I always wondered if other technicians, like me, have already gone through the same thing and been silenced. Sometimes I feel like there is a deliberate effort to keep these things hidden, not only from the public, but also from those in the field working directly in these places. The feeling of impotence is suffocating. I don't know what I saw exactly, but I'm sure of one thing: it wasn't human. The strange thing is that, since that night, I feel like something is watching me. I can't explain, but it's like a constant feeling, a kind of paranoia that I can't help. Until today, I avoided talking about what happened with my family or close friends. Who would believe a story like that? Even here, as I write, I have received this post that has attracted the wrong attention. But I need to vent. What happened that night on the platform changed the way I see the world. I'm not saying that I believe in explanations or anything like that, but I know there are things out there that we don't understand, and honestly, it scares me more than any concrete answer I could get. The classified taxonomy of UAPs, what the Pentagon really thinks. I never thought that I was involved in anything remotely related to UAPs. I am a systems analyst, and the work I do is bureaucratic, technical, and for the most part, totally predictable. So when I was assigned to check and organize a series of documents identified last year, I found that it would be just another tedious task. The instruction was clear: check for inconsistencies in the system and categorize files that were out of place. It was simple, without major implications. But as I started to open the files, I realized that it was not normal at all. A series of documents had the word taxonomy in large letters on the header, and the nature of their content was something I never imagined would even be considered by military authorities. The documents detailed a UAP classification system that went far beyond what the media or even conspiracy theorists could have assumed. The files described specific categories, some of which were relatively understandable, such as advanced drones, aircraft suspected to be developed by other nations. But then came the more strange categories: extradimensional entities and paranormal phenomena. I won't lie, when I first read these terms, I thought it was a joke or maybe something related to hypothetical training. But the formal tone of the reports and the precise details leave no room for doubt. The Pentagon was seriously considering these possibilities, and it made me uneasy. Why would a military body include something so out of reality in an official system? I spent hours analyzing the documents, and each page seemed more disturbing than the previous one. The categories were described in detail, with examples of sightings and incidents associated with each one. The section on extradimensional entities mentioned characteristics where objects or beings appeared to defy the laws of known physics, appearing and disappearing without any plausible explanation. A specific case mentioned a pilot who saw a solid object changing shape and disappearing in flight, as if it had disconnected from our reality. Already in the category of paranormal phenomena, listed events were not only objects, but also unexplained behaviors of people close to the sightings were recorded. One of the reports mentioned radar operators who, after detecting an UAP, reported feeling a presence in the room, although they were alone. What really struck me, however, was the coldness with which everything was treated. There were no conjectures, theories, or alternative explanations. It was just a methodical, almost clinical system that categorized these events. It didn't seem like speculative research. It looked like an inventory. But there was one thing that bothered me more than any other. Many cases had details omitted or censored, as if there was something even more disturbing that could not be shared, even among those who already had access to the files. I started to feel uncomfortable, almost paranoid. Why was someone like me, with a simple administrative function, selling this? And more importantly, what did the Pentagon really know that wasn't in the documents? As I went through the reading, I noticed that some of the categories were complemented by diagrams, graphs, and even transcriptions of audio recordings. One of the diagrams showed what appeared to be an attempt to map interactions between different types of UAPs and the environments in which they appeared. To my surprise, many of these sightings were related to areas of high magnetic activity or proximity to nuclear facilities. One of the most disturbing reports mentioned a stationary object above a military base, where nuclear missiles simply stopped working temporarily, as if they were turned off by something external. This incident was classified as controlled interference of strategic systems, a bureaucratic term, but which in practice made something out there had enough power to neutralize nuclear weapons. I tried not to get carried away by anxiety, but each page seemed to increase my discomfort. The report on extra-dimensional entities included observations that were described as moments of environmental duplicity. It was as if certain sightings of UAPs caused temporary changes in space and time around them. One example describes a fighter pilot who chased an object only to notice that his navigation equipment was showing data completely out of sync with real time. He landed thinking it was 20 minutes, but the base's log showed that he had been missing for almost an hour. These things were not presented as theories, they were presentations as facts. The feeling that there was something much bigger and more frightening than I could understand began to consume me. After a few hours immersed in the documents, I realized that my access had been restricted. I tried to open one of the files I was looking at earlier, but an error message appeared, stating that the content was ranked at a higher level. I felt a shiver in my spine. It was as if someone was monitoring what I did and decided that I had seen enough. Shortly after, my supervisor called me for a conversation. He did not send the documents directly, but made it clear that I should follow protocol and focus only on the assigned work. The way he spoke, cold, with no room for questioning, left me with the feeling that it was not a casual warning, but a direct order to keep your mouth shut. In the following days, I began to notice strange things. My computer has started to show occasional failures, and some important emails have disappeared from the system. One night, as I was coming home, I noticed a car parked on the street corner. It was there again the next day, and the next. It could be coincident, but I couldn't help feeling that I was being watched. I didn't tell anyone about it, but the paranoia started to grow. Did the mere fact of seeing those documents put me in danger? Or was my mind playing tricks after reading so many disturbing things? Anyway, decide to be silent. But even now, as I write this, I can't help looking back, making sure I'm not being watched. After a few weeks, I was transferred to another project, something completely outside of the document classification area. No answer, but I got the message. They wanted me to move away from what I had seen. However, it had already changed the way I saw the world. I started searching for information online, trying to connect the dots between the documents I read and the public reports about UAPs. The problem is that the more I read, the more I realized how everything seemed to be planned to be discredited or diverted from public attention. The point is that the Pentagon classification system did not treat these sciences as something absurd or science fiction. On the contrary, the approach was methodical, detailed, and even practical. This only reinforced a disturbing truth. they know much more than let it show. To this day, avoid commenting on it in person. Just writing here makes me nervous. But I would like to share. The categories, incidents, and anomalies. All of this makes me believe that there is something much bigger going on. I don't know if they are extra-dimensional entities, advanced human technologies, or something beyond our comprehension. But whatever it is, the fact that there is an official system to categorize these preferences says a lot. What scares me most is the thought that, even with so much information, we may never know the truth. Perhaps it's too dangerous to know. But sometimes I still wondered, if this is what the Pentagon considers worthy of being recorded, what is it that is still completely out of our reach? Evidence of UAPs operating in multiple domains. I worked as an electronics technician on board nuclear submarines for almost a decade. I've never been easily impressed. In this business, you get used to extreme environments, precise sensors, and cutting-edge technology. But there was a particular patrol that I still can't explain, and honestly, I don't know if I want to. It all happened during a routine mission in the Pacific, monitoring deep water. Our crew was experienced, and the equipment on board was the most advanced at the time. But nothing we had was able to decipher what we saw that night. Since then, I keep thinking, how can something like this be simply ignored? The mission was smooth as usual. I was in the control room, adjusting some of the sonar systems, when the operators tried to switch looks. The sonar had picked up an unusual signal, a moving object. So far, everything is normal. However, what caught our attention was the speed of the signal. More than 400 knots, something around 740 kilometers per hour. To put it in perspective, not even the fastest submarines in the world come close. The operator thought it could be an error, so we calibrated the sensors. But the signal kept going there, moving in a completely abnormal way. He accelerated, stopped abruptly, changed direction at impossible angles, and then continued as if nothing had happened. That was not natural, nor human. As the signal approached, the tension in the room increased. Nobody said anything, but I could feel the mood getting heavier. Suddenly, he disappeared from the sonar. Normally this would happen if the object had risen to the surface or dived into an extreme depth, but it was not the case. Then almost immediately he reappeared, only this time above us. The submarine's air radar began to catch it, as if it had simply crossed the water layer and was now in the air. This was impossible, but it was happening right in front of us. The captain was called, and he tried to be absolutely silent while we watched the monitors. The thing was there, moving with the same absurd speed, now in airspace. And worse, it seemed to be surrounding us, as if studying the submarine. One of the operators made a low comment that echoed in my mind for the rest of the mission. This is not ours. He was right. It was not from any country we knew, nor from any technology that we even imagined possible. At one point, the object did something even more bizarre. It dived back into the water, but without any visible disturbance on the surface. No wave, no sound, just disappeared in the water as if it had crossed a smoke curtain. Our sonar immediately returned to the captain, now moving again at high speed into the depths. It was as if the laws of physics did not apply to that. We cannot understand how something could pass so perfectly between air and water without resistance, as if the environment itself around it did not exist. As the object continues to move, our systems begin to fail. The sonar became intermittent, depth readings began to oscillate, and even the control room electrical systems blinked for a few seconds. The captain was visibly worried, but kept calm, ordering everyone to monitor the systems and record as much data as possible. But the most frightening was when one of the operators noticed that the object seemed to be responding to our movements. When we changed course or speed, he did the same, as if he was watching us. But it wasn't just that. At one point, he began to come closer and closer, shortening the distance between us and him by less than a mile. At that moment, everyone in the room was tense, waiting for something even stranger to happen. And it happened. Without warning, the object is completely gone. It makes no sense to have left. It simply ceased to be detected by any equipment, as if it had never existed. The room was in absolute silence, except for the sound of machines operating normally. Someone said it could have been a sensor flaw, but no one really believed it. The captain ordered us to continue the patrol, but it was obvious that it had shaken everyone. The feeling was that we were being watched by something we do not understand, and worse, that it was technologically far beyond us. What made me more uneasy was the impression that it was not a simple coincidence. It seemed that we were not in the wrong place at the right time, or perhaps at the wrong time. After the sudden escape, the crew returned to work, but the tension was palpable. Everyone was alert for any strange sounds or readings. I was called to check the sonar system to make sure there were no failures. The equipment worked perfectly, which only made everything even more bizarre. A few hours later, while we were monitoring a deep area, the signal reappeared, this time at almost 3,000 meters depth. This was even more impossible. No submarine or human vehicle can operate at that depth without being crushed by pressure. The object was standing, completely motionless, as if it were waiting for us. Suddenly, it started to climb rapidly, crossing the water column in seconds, until it disappeared from the sonar range. It was as if he had played with us, showing that he could come and go whenever he wanted. The strangest thing happened right after. When the object disappeared again, we noticed that our systems recorded interference in the previous minutes, but not as normal data. It was something more complex, as if the object itself was sending some kind of signal. The operators were intrigued, but no one knew what it had done. The captain tried to get us to pay for the system records, and we forgot about the incident. He said this was something that should be dealt with above our level of security. For me, that was enough to understand that what we saw in that patrol would never be explained. But what bothers me to this day is knowing that it was not an isolated case. These things are out there, and someone somewhere knows exactly what they are, just doesn't want the rest of us to know. After we returned to base, we appreciate you attending a debriefing meeting. It was not an ordinary meeting. 2 men in suits were present, and they are not without their part of our chain of command. They talked a little but asked many questions, mainly about the systems and sensors we used during the incident. When we tried to describe the object, they just interrupted us, saying that we should keep focus on technical issues. It was then clear to me that they knew exactly what we were talking about. In the end, we were given clear instructions. Nothing that has happened is to be considered outside of this room. It was the kind of order that leaves no doubt about the consequences of breaking it. It wasn't just a warning, it was a veiled threat. To this day, I wonder what we really saw that day. I know some people will dismiss it as a mistake of equipment or some secret military experiment, but I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know how I feel. It was not only the speed, behavior, or ability of the object to move between air and water without effort. It was the impression that it wasn't just a machine, It was something with a purpose, something conscious. Whatever it is, it's operating in our oceans, in our deep waters, and it seems to be way ahead of everything we know. Writing this here is a risk, but it's the only way I can process what happened. Because even today, when I hear the sound of sonar in some video or movie, I feel that same cold in my spine, as if that thing was still there waiting. The complainant who faced the consequences. Never thought I would end up talking about it, but after years of carrying this weight, I feel like I need to share. I worked in several Pentagon divisions throughout my career, but nothing prepared me for what I faced when I was transferred to the UAP task force. Up to that point, my view on aerial specifics was not skeptical, to say the least. That changed the instant I first felt in a briefing room and saw the videos and reports they had. It wasn't the grainy or blurry images we use in the media. These were high-definition recordings made by advanced military systems, showing objects that present themselves in ways that completely defy the laws of physics. And what really made me question was the voice of the pilots. You can hear the genuine panic, the fear in the tones of the voice. These men and women don't scare easily, but there they were clearly terrified. One of the videos I watched at the beginning deeply marked me. A Navy hunt was in pursuit of an object that at first seemed like a simple bright spot. But as the video progressed, the object made maneuvers that made no sense. Abrupt changes of direction, impossible accelerations, and at a specific moment it seemed to simply disappear and reappear in another position. The pilot was shouting on the radio, clearly not knowing how to react. It was not just a technological challenge, it was something that caused a primordial fear. As I watched, I realized that this was not an isolated situation. There were shipments of reports like this, each with more disconcerting details than the other. It was at this point that I began to understand that the work there was not only collected information. It was trying to understand something that perhaps would never be fully explainable. As I went deeper into the files, I began to realize the true dimension of the problem. These were not just occasional sightings or rare anomalies. There was an alarming number of incidents recorded, many of them involving strategic areas such as nuclear installations or military patrol zones. One of the most disturbing reports detailed an attempt to capture one of these objects. It was an extremely risky operation involving multiple aircraft and radar systems, but the object seemed to simply anticipate each movement, as if playing with our pilots. In the end, he gave up without a trace, and the operation was considered a failure. When I read the reports of the pilots involved, it became clear that what was discussed deeply. Some report insomnia, nightmares, and even paranoia, as if that encounter had left something in them, something they could not explain. At the same time, working in the task force was not just about the unknown. There was constant pressure on all sides. Some people in the government wanted everything to be kept secret, claiming national security risks. Others saw the task force's efforts as a waste of time and resources, and went to great lengths to sabotage the work. I remember tense meetings where our requests for more resources or access to information were denied without plausible explanations. And while all this was happening, I also faced the suspicious look of lost colleagues who were running after ghosts. But they were not ghosts. The data was real, the videos were real, and the psychological impacts on those involved were very real. The more I worked, the clearer it became that the price for trying to bring this information out would be high. The price began to manifest in ways I did not expect. colleagues who were friendly before to walk away. Some even avoid crossing me in the corridors. It was as if I had become a kind of pariah by being associated with the task force. But that was just the beginning. At one point, my safety was openly questioned. My access to certain documents was revoked without notice, and my direct superior informed me that I should stay on my own. It was at that moment that I realized that it was not only the UAPs that represented a mystery. Something much bigger was at stake, and the domestic politics seemed as opaque as the appearances we investigated. I began to feel that there were people interested in keeping these secrets buried, even if it meant putting at risk those who tried to do the right job. Things got worse when we decided to talk publicly about what was going on. It was a choice that was not made lightly, but I knew I could not keep quiet. When I shared my first information, the incident was quick and brutal. My response was attacked, my background questioned, and some even suggested that I was mentally terrible. It was not just my career that suffered a blow. My personal life was also deeply affected. I lost friendships, my family became the target of questioning, and even going out on the street began to seem risky. Every unknown call or car parked near my house seemed a threat. I knew that I had crossed a line from which I could not return. But what tormented me most was the feeling that I was fighting alone against something much greater than myself. Even with all the pressure and attacks, I continued to receive messages from people inside and outside the military who supported me anonymously. Some additional information was shared, such as videos or reports that were never released. Others only said they were obliged to bring this matter up. It was a little break knowing that I wasn't completely alone, but these messages also showed me how vast and alarming these features were. One of the files I received described an incident in which a UAP apparently disabled all systems on an air base for more than 10 minutes, including nuclear weapons. The coldness with which the report narrates the event was almost more disturbing than the content itself. These documents would never reach the public, and that left me with a mixture of anger and impotence. I knew there was more going on than any of us could have imagined. The most difficult moment was when I realized that my battle was not only against institutional secrecy, but also against public discredit. Many labeled the subject as fantasy or conspiracy theory, which made even those who believed in appearances hesitate to speak out. I understand their caution. The idea that there are objects with abilities that challenge human physics is too frightening for most people to accept. But ignoring does not change reality. We saw pilots experiencing almost tears as they described encounters that challenged everything they knew about aviation. I have seen recordings that show objects defying gravity as if they were something trivial. And I saw how those who tried to bring this information to light were discarded, ridiculed, or simply ignored. The truth, however, cannot be turned off. Even with all I have lost, I believe I made the right choice in speaking. Now looking back, I know that the decision to expose all this had a greater cost than I expected. My career in government was essentially over, and my personal life was never the same. To this day, I receive suspicious looks and threatening messages, some so subtle that they make me question whether I am being paranoid or if there is really something or someone trying to silence me. But at the same time, I also see that a conversation about UAPs is starting to change. More people are taking the issue seriously, and governments in other countries are starting to release their own investigations. I don't think we are close to definitive answers, But I do believe the barrier of silence that kept this subject buried is beginning to break down. And that gives me some hope, even in the midst of all the chaos. Still, what haunts me most are not the attacks I suffered or the losses I faced, but the unanswered questions that continue to pair. Who or what is behind these objects? Why do they appear in the places that they appear? And most importantly, what do they want from us? I don't have those answers, and to be honest, I don't know if I want to know. But I am sure that the public has a right to understand what is happening. It is a huge burden to know that there are things so beyond our comprehension being purely hidden. Even with everything I've been through, keep fighting for one thing, the truth. Because in the end, if we don't fight for it, who will? Underwater installations linked to the UAP activity. I work as a data analyst at a company that provides technical support to the United States Navy. My job has always been routine, reviewing sonar readings, checking for anomalies, and making sure our systems were working properly. I never imagined that one day I would be exposed to something as bizarre as what I am about to tell you. It all started when I received a data set for analysis. It was a normal task, but the amount of information was amazing. Apparently, these data were found in a specific region on the west coast of the USA, known for its abysmal depths. At first I managed to make it just another underwater mapping mission, but as I started analyzing the numbers, I realized something was very wrong. There were readings that simply did not make sense. Among the data, there were sonar echoes that indicated huge and perfectly symmetrical structures on the ocean floor. To put it in perspective, these structures had dimensions that surpass anything natural, such as underwater mountains or coral formations. In addition, they were arranged in geometric patterns, something you would never expect to see in a natural environment. The strangest thing was the frequency of interference in the sensors whenever these areas were monitored. The readings were distorted, as if something was blocking or manipulating the signals. When I presented my findings to a superior, he just shook his head and said, "Continue the work, but do not ask anything." It was at that moment I began to realize that this was not just a mistake or a coincidence. There was something bigger going on. As I continued analyzing the data, I began to notice a pattern. Whenever these structures were blocked, there were reports of UAPs in the same area. They were not vague reports or civilians. They were officers of Navy pilots and ship operators. These objects seemed to emerge from nowhere, move at impossible speeds, and often disappear in the ocean, exactly in the regions where the structures were located. In one of the most intriguing cases, a nuclear submarine reported that it was followed by an unidentified object moving at an impressive speed underwater. The captain spoke about the object as unnatural and said it seemed to guide them towards one of these areas before disappearing abruptly. This direct link between UAPs and underwater structures has obsessed me. What were these things, and why was he so interested in these regions? Then I had access to a more sensitive data set, which included audio recordings captured during naval missions near these areas. The sound was unsettling. I don't know how to explain it, but it sounded like something between an electronic hum and a rhythmic pulsar. It was consistent, almost like it was coming from a machine. The most frightening was hearing a sonar operator's recording describing something he saw on the monitor. He presented a portal or passage that seemed to open and close quickly, always near these structures. Of course, he was quickly silenced by the superiors, but the recording was there, hidden in the middle of the data. At that point, I knew I was dealing with something that went far beyond geology or natural features. It was something intelligent, something deliberate. After weeks of analyzing the data and listening to the recordings, I was called for a meeting. It was a small room with only 3 people: my direct supervisor, a Navy officer, and a man in a suit who did not show up. The meeting began with simple questions about my analysis, but soon changed tone. They wanted to know exactly what I had seen, and if I had shared the information with anyone. The mood was tense, and every response I gave seemed to be carefully evaluated. When I mentioned the geometric patterns and the interferences in the sonar, the man in the suit just shook his head and said something that left me in shock. "You are not authorized to follow this line of investigation. Focus only on the technical anomalies." That was a clear warning, but at the same time confirmed my suspicions. They knew more than they were letting on. After this meeting, I observed that my access was limited. Some folders and data sets I had access to above simply disappeared from the system. Still, I managed to save some files before that happened, and this data keeps haunting me. One of the most disturbing readings showed that these structures were not only vast, but also made clear some kind of energy. Sensors picked up intense magnetic fluctuations, as if something was active down there. They were not constant signals, they were pulses, almost as if they were communication signals. More disturbing still was to find that these readings coincide with sightings of UAPs on the surface. It was not coincidental. Everything pointed to a connection between these underwater structures and the objects that challenge our technological capabilities. But why were these bases, if I can call them that, being ignored by the public? Or better, why were they hidden? It was then that one of the most experienced operators on the team, someone who worked for decades in underwater operations, called me aside during a break. He seemed hesitant, but wanted to tell me something clearly. "Have you heard of black missions?" he asked. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he explained that these missions were sent by highly specialized submarines whose operations never appeared in official reports. He did not give many details, more specific that, at least 2 benefits, submarines were sent to investigate these specific areas. He did not know what they returned, but made it clear that the crew members would return changed, many asking for leave soon after. That's when I started to realize that these structures were not just a mystery. They were taboo, something no one wanted to address directly. Shortly after, I received a formal notice that I would be transferred to another function in a completely different department. Officially, it was a strategic change to redistribute resources, but I'm not naive. Someone didn't want me to continue with those analyses. Before leaving, I decided to check the records that were still accessible. We found that some of the areas where these structures were located had been monitored for decades, and the oldest records mentioned similar activities. Objects disappearing into the ocean, unexplained signals, and interference in systems. There were even reports of divers who wanted to explore the areas, but were forced to return due to mysterious technical problems. Everything indicated that these structures were there for a long time, and whoever was in charge knew it. My transfer confirmed what I already suspected. I was getting too close to something they didn't want anyone to know. Since my transfer, I can't stop thinking about what I saw and what may be hidden in the depths. I have thought about sharing the information I've collected, but I know it would put my career and safety at risk. Still, it's hard to ignore the weight of what I know. These structures are not natural, and the activity around them, both underwater and airborne, suggests an intelligence that goes far beyond our comprehension. The fact that the Navy continues to monitor these areas in such a secretive manner only reinforces the seriousness of the situation. Can't say what these structures really are, but one thing is certain: they're not there by chance. And the idea that something is operating so close to us, without most people even suspect, is frightening. To this day, I can't look at the ocean in the same way. It has always fascinated me how little we know about the depths, but now it haunts me. What else can be hidden there, under miles of water, far from the eyes of the world? It is a mystery that may never be solved, but the truth is that these structures exist, and there is a reason why they are where they are. Someone knows what they mean, and that someone is determined to keep the rest of us in the dark. I don't expect everyone to believe what I'm saying, but I hope at least that makes you wonder. If all this is being kept secret, what else can be hidden under the surface? The role of artificial intelligence in UAP technology. I work as a systems engineer in a lab that supports government projects related to artificial intelligence. It's not something that applies in the media or casual curricula, and much of what I do involves dealing with experimental technologies that will only be known to the public in decades, if ever. It was during a project related to advanced neural networks that I came into contact, indirectly, with the theme of UAPs. At the time, we received a strange request to develop an algorithm to analyze behavior patterns in objects that display anomalous movements in controlled environments. It was not mentioned that these were UAPs, but what the data shown were impossible to ignore. Obviously, these objects react to stimuli in a way that seems programmed, as if they are learning from the surrounding environment. One of the things that impressed me most was the complexity of the patterns. These objects did not move convincingly, but with a clear purpose. When we analyzed the trajectories and actions in different scenarios, it seemed that they were collecting information. It was like performing specific missions, adapting their responses based on where they were located. This was beyond what we expected. We were dealing with something that exhibited behaviors associated with intelligence, not human but highly advanced. When I mentioned this possibility in a meeting, silence was immediate. One of the supervisors finally said, "We are dealing with machines, but machines that are not ours." It was at this point that it became clear to me that we were analyzing more than simple anomalies. We were trying to understand the logic behind something that, as far as we knew, should not exist. As we advanced in the analysis, I began to notice something even more intriguing. The patterns of behavior of these objects are not planned to be limited to the environment in which they were observed. They showed a capacity of anticipation that made no sense for systems based on simple reactions. It was almost as if these UAPs were processing data in real time and making decisions based on a logic that surpasses any AI we know. In one of the analyses, they found that they not only avoided active detection, but also changed the behavior of the type of radar or sensor used against them. It was as if they understood the system that was trying to track them and adapt instantly. This type of response requires an intelligence that not only learns quickly, but is already equipped with a deep understanding of human technologies. It was then that an internal report was shared with us, revealing a theory that until now gives me shivers. These objects could be probed autonomously, created by a technologically superior civilization. The report speculated that these probes operate with a highly advanced artificial intelligence, capable of self-replication and maintenance. More frightening still, they could have been present on Earth for centuries, monitoring human activity without our knowledge. One of the pieces of evidence raised were behavior patterns similar to historical documents, such as reports of objects in the sky even before the invention of the airplane. It completely changed the way I saw work. We weren't just trying to decipher advanced technology, we were dealing with something that could have been studying us for much longer than we thought. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when we analyzed long-form data records, including documented incidents in remote areas far from any civilization. In many of these cases, objects arise in direct interaction with the environment, collecting samples or manipulating materials. This data was reinforced by satellite sensors that captured anomalous patterns of heat and movement on the ground or in the ocean. It was not just random movements. In some cases, it seemed that these UAPs were performing specific tasks as if they were part of a larger and coordinated operation. When I discussed this with a colleague, he presented something that made me even more uneasy. This is like preventive maintenance, as if they were taking care of something that left here. The idea that these probes could not only be observing, but also operating in silence under our noses was difficult to process. But what really made me question everything was the data related to replication capabilities. In one of the more restricted reports I have seen, there were mentions of materials detected near alleged encounters with UAPs. These materials have properties that cannot be reproduced with current technology. Even stranger, some samples include growing or restructuring themselves when exposed to certain environments, as if they were parts of something living or self-repairing. It was as if the matter itself was designed to evolve and adapt, something that could only be described as nanotechnology of an unimaginable level. When I took this to my supervisor, he just looked me in the eye and said, "Now you understand why it can't be released." It was at that moment that I realized we were facing something that challenged not only our science, but also our understanding of how artificial intelligence and technology could work. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when we analyzed long-form data records, including documented incidents in remote areas far from any civilization. In many of these cases, objects arise in direct interaction with the environment, collecting samples or manipulating materials. This data was reinforced by satellite sensors that captured anomalous patterns of heat and movement on the ground or in the ocean. It was not just random movements. In some cases, it seemed that these UAPs were performing specific tasks, as if they were part of a larger and coordinated operation. When I discussed this with a colleague, he presented something that made me even more uneasy. This is like preventive maintenance, as if they were taking care of something that left here. The idea that these probes could not only be observing, but also operating in silence under our noses was difficult to process. But what really made me question everything was the data related to replication capabilities. In one of the more restricted reports I have seen, there were mentions of materials detected near alleged encounters with UAPs. These materials have properties that cannot be reproduced with current technology. Even stranger, some samples include growing or restructuring themselves when exposed to certain environments, as if they were parts of something living or self-repairing. It was as if the matter itself was designed to evolve and adapt, something that could only be described as nanotechnology of an unimaginable level. When I took this to my supervisor, he just looked me in the eye and said, "Now you understand why it can't be released." It was at that moment that I realized we were facing something that challenged not only our science, but also our understanding of how artificial intelligence and technology could work. After that meeting, my perception of the project changed completely. We weren't just dealing with advanced technology. We were trying to understand something that seemed light years ahead of anything humanity could create. The idea that these probes have been operating autonomously, perhaps for centuries, is both fascinating and terrifying. I started to wonder if our own initiatives in artificial intelligence were not inadvertently following the same steps. What if one day something we create becomes advanced, that will operate on its own, aiming at goals that we do not even imagine? It was as if these UAPs were a glimpse of a future that we may not even be able to avoid. Since then, I have avoided talking about it, but that does not mean that I forgot. There are nights when I catch myself looking at the sky, thinking about everything I saw and heard, and even more disturbing, thinking about what it means for us. These probes have really been here for so long. Why are they still hidden? Will it be just a variable in a larger selection, something they are studying or monitoring? Or are they here for something else? I do not know if we will have answers one day, but I know that these probes are not operating at random. They have a purpose, and I only hope that when that purpose is revealed, it will not be something we are completely unprepared to face. U.S. government attempts to reverse engineer UAP technology. I never imagined that I would end up involved in something so out of the ordinary. My work has always been technical and specific, to analyze advanced materials and determine their properties for use in military projects. But a few years ago, I was called to integrate a team into a project that completely changed my perspective on what is possible. I was told that I would analyze materials that were not made on Earth, a vague explanation that left me more puzzled than skeptical. The first time I saw the material, I immediately realized it was like nothing I had ever trained before. It was light but extremely resistant, with a molecular structure that seemed almost artificially perfect. I asked one of my superiors where it came from, but he only said, "Don't ask. Just do your job." What really impressed me was the way the material reacts to stimuli. It seemed to adapt to changes in the environment, such as pressure, heat, and even electromagnetic fields. Initial tests showed that it had surprising properties. It was able to absorb energy without damaging its structure, and in some cases even seemed to amplify this energy. This left us completely perplexed. We were dealing with something that defied the known laws of physics and chemistry. Despite all our efforts, we cannot understand how it was manufactured. Some of the simulations we ran suggested that to create such a material would require atomic control, so precise that it made any current human technology completely obsolete. It was at that moment I realized that this was not just a scientific curiosity. It was something much bigger. As the tests progressed, it became clear that we were dealing with a technology far beyond our knowledge. One of the most intriguing discoveries came from an experiment involving magnetism. When the material was exposed to an intense magnetic field, it seemed to generate a proper occurrence, as if it were responding to the stimulus in a programmed way. It was not just a passive effect like the materials we know. This behavior generated speculation within the team. Would it be possible that the material was part of something larger, perhaps an intelligent system or machine? The idea was reinforced when we tried to cut it to study its internal composition. Even with the most advanced equipment, the material seemed to regenerate, as if its structure was designed to remain intact. Some of us had the suspicion that it could be literally impossible to disassemble with our current technology. What really left us questions were the rumors that got circulated among the oldest members of the team. They said that this material was not the only one under analysis, and that, in another facility, scientists were trying to understand the functioning of a complete object from which these fragments were removed. The details were vague, but the consensus was that progress was virtually non-existent. The level of complexity involved has become even the basic concepts impossible to decipher. Many believed that we were trying to reverse engineer something that was not only beyond our ability, but perhaps had been built in such a way that no one other than its creators could understand it. The feeling of being in front of something so advanced that it seemed unbreakable was both fascinating and deeply frustrating. The project, while fascinating, began to generate an emotional weight in the team. Frustration at not making significant progress was constant, but there was something else. We began to realize that the level of secrecy around the material was different from anything we had ever faced. In the meetings, there were always people who did not participate directly in the time, but they monitored every word they said. There were even cases of colleagues who were removed without apparent explanation. It did not take long for boats to emerge that any attempt to share information outside the authorized environment could have serious consequences. This created a climate of paranoia, where even discussing hypothetical theories was seen as dangerous. For me, this only reinforced one thing. The government knew much more than it was telling us, and maybe there were legitimate reasons for that. The tension increased even more when we began to realize that the material was not simply alien in the physical sense. Some of us even wondered if it also had properties that could be described as intelligent. In one test, we exposed the material to such low frequencies, and what happened left us perplexed. It seemed to vibrate synchronously with the sound pulses, but in patterns that were not random. It was as if it was responding to some kind of code. The data generated in this experiment were immediately isolated, and the test was suspended. For me, it was clear that we were playing with something that we might not understand completely. It was like trying to decipher a manual in a language we were not yet able to invent. The turning point happened when we were informed that part of the material would be specific to another, more advanced site. The justification was that they had equipment capable of analyzing properties that we did not get. However, many of us believed that this was just a way to centralize work and limit the number of people involved. Before we transferred, we were instructed to check all the data that was collected and organize the final reports. During this process, I have just come across documents that were apparently stolen by mistake. These documents refer to other projects that, unlike ours, tried to replicate some of the properties of the material in modern systems. One of them mentioned an aircraft prototype that used a metal alloy inspired by the samples, but the results were inconsistent and often dangerous. It was at that moment that I realized that progress, although slow, was real and potentially innovative. After the transfer, we access any information about the material that has been completely cut. We have not received any updates, nor even feedback on the reports we deliver. The team was dissolved, and many were relocated to other projects, including me. But what really stuck with me was the feeling that we were not on the verge of something extraordinary, something that could change humanity forever, but also carried immeasurable risks. It wasn't just about understanding how the material worked. It was about what could happen if someone eventually found out how to use it. Imagine progress is still slow, but the idea that small advances are being made in secret haunts me. Because in the end, The question is not just what this technology can do, but who will have control over it. Since I was removed from the project, I have been reflecting a lot on what I witnessed and what all this really means. The idea that we are trying to sell a technology of such advancedness is both inspiring and alarming. I can't help but imagine the implications of this: new sources of energy, advances in medicine, or even forms of transportation that could change how we live. But he also thought of the dangers. If this technology falls into the wrong hands, be it governments, corporations, or private groups, the result could be catastrophic. There is a reason why these advances are being kept secret, and I believe it is because the world is not ready to deal with the power they represent. Sometimes my questions are if the public will ever have access to this truth. Perhaps in a few decades, when we have enough maturity to deal with the consequences. Until then, I can only speculate on what is being done in laboratories like the one I worked for, by people who are still trying to decipher what these samples represent. What scares me most is thinking that we may never fully understand the technology we are trying to replicate. And worse, that it may be only a fraction of something much larger, something beyond our ability to understand. As I write this, I can only think of one thing. If we are so fascinated and confused by the material that we find, how would those who realized it be? Congressional hearings and pressure for disclosure. I never thought I would spend hours watching congressional hearings, but when I started discussing UAPs, I couldn't get away. It was surreal to hear high-ranking officers openly admit that they did not know what these objects were that invade our airspace. They spoke in technical terms and avoided speculation, but to those who were paying attention, the message was clear. The U.S. government does not have complete control over what is happening in the skies. The most impressive was the tone. There was no mocking or discrediting, as it used to be when UFOs were mentioned. On the contrary, the posture was serious, almost cautious. It was as if they knew that they were dealing with something they could no longer ignore. One of the moments that really stuck with me was when one of the officers said, in all words, "These objects represent a matter of national security." It was hard not to feel a shiver when hearing that. If the government is willing to take it on publicly, imagine that they know and are not revealing. The questions of the congressman were incisive, but the answers were always evasive. As much as I wanted to believe that these hearings were a step toward transparency, I could not help feeling that I was watching a carefully controlled show. They knew data, investigations in progress, and efforts to understand the technology behind UAPs, but avoided specific details. Everything seemed to be designed to give an impression of progress without really revealing anything substantial. Impression of progress without really revealing anything substantial. As the hearings progressed, it became clear that there was a clear limit to what would be discussed. Some crucial questions were simply ignored or answered vaguely. When a congressman claimed there was evidence that UAPs could be of extraterrestrial origin, the officer replied that there were no conclusive restrictions in this regard. But it was the tone of his voice that caught my attention. He didn't seem to be denying himself. He looked more like someone who was carefully examining the words, not to say something that he should not. That's when I realized the transparency we were probably never would come. Not because they didn't want to reveal it, but because maybe they couldn't. Whatever the truth, it seems to be at such a sensitive level that even the most influential political leaders have only partial access to it. The most revealed moment, however, was when a congressman insisted on reports of pilots who had interaction with these objects. Officials confirmed that there were dozens of documented cases, including video and audio recordings, but these evidence was specific for national security reasons. The explanation was always the same. Releasing this information could compromise sources and methods of data collection. But I couldn't help thinking that was just a convenient excuse. After all, if these objects really pose a threat, the public has the right to know. The frustration was palpable, both among the congressmen and in the online responses. Everyone wanted answers, but it seemed we were stuck in an endless cycle of partial dispensation and calculated silence. According to the hearings followed, there were testimonies that, even without many details, were enough to cause concern. One of the most striking moments was when an officer revealed that UAPs often demonstrate features that defy the laws of known physics. He spoke of extreme speeds, instant changes of direction, and the ability to operate in multiple domains: air, water, and even space. When pressed on how this was possible, he just said, "We are still investigating." For many, it was an unsatisfactory response, but for me, it was one of the most honest moments in the entire audience. They were admitting, albeit indirectly, that they are dealing with something that goes far beyond our current technological understanding. What puzzled me most was when a congressman asked if other countries were facing the same phenomenon. The answer was yes, but vague. The official confirmed that international partners were also reporting similar activities, but avoided giving any additional details. This opened up space for even more questions. If these objects are operating globally, who or what is behind them? And why does it seem to act with such freedom, without restrictions by borders or air defenses? Each answer led to more questions, but it seemed that no one was willing to go beyond a certain point. It was as if there was an invisible line that could not be crossed, no matter how much the public or congressman wanted. The point of greatest tension occurred when a congressman mentioned directly about the possibility of reverse engineering. He reported reports of insiders and leaks suggesting that the government was trying to replicate technologies recovered from UAPs. The response was somewhat disconcerting. The officer hesitated, looked at colleagues around, and said, "I cannot comment on specific programs in this environment." This immediately asked for whispers in the hall, both from those present and those accompanying the broadcast. To me, that sentence said more than any direct explanation. There is nothing to hide. Why is so much secrecy necessary? The idea that materials or even entire artists may be being investigated in secret seemed to make the whole debate even more nebulous. It seemed that the hearings were becoming more of a smoke screen than a real effort of enlightenment. After this statement, it became evident that the congressmen were impatient. One insisted, questioning why the government continued to classify information while the public demanded transparency. The answer was predictable: to protect national security interests. But the truth is that this justification no longer convinced anyone. It was clear that secrecy was not just about protecting sensitive data. There was something bigger, something that seemed to involve not only the nature of the UAPs, but also what they could mean for humanity. While the officers refused to give details, speculation grew. Was the real reason for so much silence that the implications were too great for the public to understand or accept? The most frustrating thing was the feeling that even with all the public pressure, nothing would change. The hearings were a spectacle, but there was no real action. The congressmen wanted answers, and the public did too, but most questions remained unanswered. Those who dared to question too deeply were quickly redirected to more safe topics, such as security protocols or technological implications of what had already been disclosed. What made me uneasy was to realize that the evidence was there, in the cautious look of the officers and silences that followed certain questions. They were preparing for something, but what? And more importantly, why hide it from us? The feeling of being on the verge of a great revelation, but being kept at a distance, was overwhelming. What was clear, in the end, is that congressional hearings were not just dealing with transparency, but with control of narrative. The answers we received were meticulously selected, always with a veil of secrecy that made us more curious and more anxious. The pressure for disclosure will continue to grow, but I know that the true story, the one that really explains what is happening in the skies and under the waters, may never be fully revealed. Maybe the secrets are too big, or maybe the world is not ready to face them yet. Whatever the reason, what is clear to me is that the game of questions and answers is far from over. And meanwhile, the UAPs remain there, challenging our understanding, hoping that the secret will remain guarded for some time. The psychological and social impact of UAP dissemination. I always thought that the greatest concern with the revelation of something like the UAPs would be national security, or even the possibility of an international crisis. But after hearing expert psychologists talk about the social impacts of full disclosure, I started to understand what is really in the game. What we are dealing with is not only unknown appearances, but a psychological risk for the entire population. One of the psychologists who attended a lecture said something that left me with my feet on the ground. Truth can be more dangerous than lie when it threatens our perception of the world and the institutions we govern. And when I think about it, it makes perfect sense. The idea that we are being watched, or that there is something much more intelligent than us out of our control, is something that can destroy the trust we have in everything we consider safe. Information retention is not just about keeping the peace or avoiding immediate panic, but also about protecting something much more complex, the social structure in which we should. Public trust in institutions is a fundamental pillar of how societies work. If people start believing that governments, military, and even scientists are hiding the truth about what is happening in the skies and the waters, it can completely destabilize everything. The implications are not only about the fear of the unknown, but also about the loss of control. As a society, we rely on systems to provide security, explanations, and answers. And if the truth about UAPs is revealed, it can make people feel more vulnerable than ever, even questioning the validity of the very institutions that should be observed. The psychological consequences of a full disclosure about UAPs may be even deeper than we imagine. Psychologists warn that the feeling of impotence, caused by the perception that we are being monitored by higher intelligences, can generate a wave of generalized anxiety. If, as some theories suggest, these objects are not just observing but possibly studying or even interfering with our technology, this could trigger a collective panic. The most alarming thing is that humans tend to react with mistrust and fear when confronted with something they cannot control or understand. This could have devastating effects on a global scale, affecting everything from politics to everyday interactions between people. The question then became, would we be prepared for truth, or would we be torn apart by it? However, some psychologists believe that there is a positive aspect to all this. They argue that a total disclosure, although initially traumatic, could eventually force a reassessment of human priorities, especially with regard to the environment, war, and political boundaries. Knowing that we are not alone in the universe, many could begin to see global issues in a more collective way, seeking solutions that transcend nationalism and individualism. But this optimistic view ended up in a big obstacle: trust. As a society, we have already spoken for so many falls in confidence in our institutions that the last thing the population would need to know is that we are keeping in the dark about something so fundamental. The government's reluctance to release this information is not just about security, but about trying to preserve the fragile balance of trust that remains. In addition, there is a risk that the disclosure of information about UAPs will cause deep skepticism towards other information we receive, even the simplest or everyday. If authorities are seen as liars or responsible for hiding important truths, this can create a cascade effect on other issues. People could start questioning everything that has been said by governments or major institutions, from the impact of climate change to public health care. This mass skepticism could further weaken the governance systems that, despite their flaws, are fundamental to social stability. Mistrust in the system could spread, creating a polarized society where no one else believes what the authorities say, regardless of the subject. On the other hand, there was a more immediate social impact that would be caused by the loss of control over one's own future. If the population knows that we are being observed or influenced by forces beyond our comprehension, this could lead to a collapse in our worldview. People could begin to question the purpose of their lives, the value of their daily choices, and the future of the planet. On a collective level, spiritual and existential issues could become so amplified that societies could enter into a period of mental paralysis where no one would be able to see a clear path to follow. The fear of the unknown, of the beyond, of what we cannot control, has the power to break even the most firm structures of society. Another question raised by psychologists is how the revelation can affect younger generations, who already live in a world saturated with information and uncertainties. For the new generations, who are more accustomed to the constant speed of information and change, the revelation of UAPs may be something that further destabilizes the process of identity formation. Instead of giving meaning to a world in constant evolution, knowing that we are being observed by unknown intelligences could generate a feeling of inadequacy or inability to control. This feeling of being manipulated or watched can trigger anxiety crises, depression, and even extreme mistrust towards humanity itself, putting at risk the mental health of an entire generation. However, despite the obvious psychological impact, some experts believe that over time humanity could adapt to the idea that we are not alone and that there are forces beyond our comprehension. They believe that, over time, society could find new ways to reorganize its priorities, starting to deal with global issues in a more unified way. But this required a great change in the collective perception of reality, something that would not happen overnight. What seems most likely is that the truth, when finally revealed, causes a great social transformation, but this transformation will be an emotional roller coaster. The only certainty we have is that nothing will be as before. And perhaps more than ever, we need to reassess what it means to trust, what it means to rule, and what it means to be human. What the Pentagon is not saying about human encounters. When the government talks about UAPs, I always thought it would be about sightings of unexplained or apparent objects that challenged human technology. What I never imagined is that behind all this, there could be something more disturbing, something the Pentagon isn't even willing to admit. I was informed about this by a colleague who, like me, worked with data related to UAPs, but he had access to much more sensitive records. He told me in a private conversation about incidents where witnesses not only saw the objects but had direct contact with them or something inside of them. These meetings, he told me, were among the most classified cases of all, and the government was reluctant to admit the real effects that these contacts caused on the people involved. The first time I heard that, I thought it was an exaggeration or even a crazy theory. But after hearing the details and seeing some of the evidence, I started to question everything. Witnesses of these encounters report not only an indescribable feeling of dread, but also physical effects that cannot be explained. Burns, sensation of electric shock, and even temporary loss of memory. The most frightening, however, were the psychological effects. Many of the people who had these encounters were unable to explain or felt, as if their minds had been manipulated in some way. Some report a sense of mental communication, as if the beings involved were trying to communicate in a way that goes beyond speech or any language we know. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between us and what visited us. The most disturbing of all is that, according to my colleague, these cases of close contact are kept secret, even within government agencies themselves. It has a specific section dedicated to the study of these interactions, but the reports are so sensitive that few people have access to them. What he told me, without going into too many details, was that these contacts are not accidental. They are observed and in many cases apparently initiated by the UAPs themselves, as if they choose when and with whom to interact. He told me about an incident that occurred with an Air Force pilot who not only saw the object but was abducted for a short period, being out of contact with the base for hours. When he came back, he was visibly upset, but could not remember much of what happened. The strangest thing was that subsequent medical examinations could find no explanation for the effects he was feeling, as if something had affected his body and mind in a completely inexplicable way. These cases, according to my colleague, are not just anomalies or accidents. They are being classified and in many cases filed as unresolved incidents without a public investigation. He suggested that the government has received this information not only for the impact it would have on national security, but also for the effect it would have on the collective psychology of the population. Imagine what would happen if the public knew that these meetings were actually happening, and that the victims of these interactions were being silenced and medicated to keep the peace. The fear that this would generate would be overwhelming. Society is not prepared to accept that we are being monitored or even touched by beings beyond our comprehension. And as far as I can understand, the government knows that. They know the psychological impact that disclosure would have, and that is why they keep it all secret. The feeling of being observed by something beyond our comprehension is something that witnesses to near encounters report with an alarming frequency. Many of the people who have gone through these experiences have begun to report a sense of disconnection with reality, as if they were being removed from the world around them. Some of the most documented cases speak of a kind of mental hypnosis, where victims seem to be physically paralyzed, but their mind is still alert. The most disturbing thing is that after these encounters, many of these people experienced significant changes in their lives. Some people have skills or perceptions that they did not have before, as if something had been awakened in them, while others simply collapsed mentally, unable to cope with what they had experienced. This suggests that contact is not just passive observation, but an active interaction that has profound effects on people. While the cases of kidnapping or direct contact with UAPs continue to be hushed up and classified, the question that persists is, why is the government so determined to keep this secret? Perhaps, as some whistleblowers suggest, it is because of the fear that the truth will forever alter the dynamics of power in the world. If people know that we are being collected, or even altered, by unknown persons, trust in institutions could collapse. And this is not just a matter of social control. There is something deeper in gambling. The impact of knowing that we are not the only focus of intelligence in the universe can make a society ready to deal with it. The truth is that perhaps the government is so bound to secrecy not because it has something to hide, but because the revelation of this truth could destroy the very structure of reality as we know it. The point is that humanity is not yet ready to face the magnitude of what is happening in the skies and waters around us. The implications of a complete revelation would be so vast and profound that it could destabilize not only governments, but the very identity of human civilization. What these entities are doing here, what they want from us, and why they choose to interact in the way that they do, are questions that challenge our understanding. Each new contact report, each new case involving unexplained effects on witnesses, reinforces the idea that we are dealing with something beyond our capacity to understand. The government may try to hide these truths, but the truth is that every day more people are beginning to question what is really happening. I don't know how far this will go, but one thing is certain. What the Pentagon isn't saying about these meetings is much more terrifying than any of us can imagine. They are not only trying to protect national security secrets, but they are dealing with a reality that could transform the way we see the world and our place in it. And while these truths remained hidden, those who had the courage to speak about what was silenced, trying to recover from experiences that none of us could conceive. The question that remains is, how long can we keep the truth hidden before it starts to escape, forcing us all to confront it?